Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Yesterday, we were talking about Simon of Cyrene, the guy who was carrying the cross for Jesus because Jesus was too beat up to do it. And I think I speculated a little bit. I don't know. I never did go back and listen to that. Jeff just edits it right up and publishes it for me, and he does a great job. So sometimes I get a couple days behind on listening to my own podcast, which is fun. It's like, you know, finding $5 in your pocket in the laundry. And like, oh, yeah, there's Bible stuff that I was thinking about the other day. I'm excited to see what I thought about it the other day. But I think at the end of that, I was saying that, okay, I'm not totally sure why Matthew used some of his precious scroll real estate to include this little nugget, this little detail, that there was a guy from Cyrene who carried Jesus' cross. I would speculate that this is to point toward the idea that the whole Jesus thing is transcending cultural boundaries, that there's a new family of faith. Maybe it's a way to round out the thought that it should have been the Jewish leaders who recognized Jesus and showed care for him, even if it was compulsory, and they're nowhere to be seen, and some complete rando outsider who theoretically has no claim on or interest in this situation. He's the one who's there in this absolute desperate hour of need. Maybe it plays on the abandonment theme that everybody else is gone. So you just get some guy from the far reaches of North Africa who's the only one who's left to do anything to help Jesus out, who's abandoned by everyone else. I don't think any of those things that I just said are wrong, but I don't totally know. There are a ton of historical details. I mean, the majority of historical details Matthew left out of this thing. But you and I, you know, I'm not delivering sermons here on a daily basis. That's not the exercise. It's not the format. It's not the medium here. You and I are trying to do a raw read on this text and hold as much of the raw data of what Matthew is presenting in front of us in our minds at once. We're trying to spread it all out on the table so we can take it in at once so that we can see patterns and understand it for ourselves in ways that might be more difficult if we were to handle it in a more piecemeal fashion. What that means is that sometimes I'm diving into historical rabbit trails and details where I'm like, oh, I got a sneaking suspicion. I know where this one is going. And I really do have a sense of why I think it's all there and how this fits and how this advances all the things Matthew is trying to do. Other times like this, I'm not 100% sure. I really couldn't say with certainty. What I do know, though, is that we should dive into every one of these rabbit trails we possibly can so that we can have as much data in front of us to give ourselves the best chance of understanding it on the deepest level possible. So we got the things we talked about yesterday, and I kept saying more on that in a minute, more on that in a minute. Well, it's been a minute, so now here's the more on that. This Cyrene place, like all places, means something, although I'm not exactly sure what. So here's a bunch of details about Cyrene. So you can do the math and connect the dots the way you want to. What we know about Cyrene: it was a city and a region that was settled by Greek colonists in the 7th century BC. Greek history is divided up into a series of ebbs and flows, and there were a couple of moments in ancient Greek history where stuff is so far back that it mingles with all of the myths and everything that you've heard about, where the Greeks were doing pretty well, and then there are other moments where the language isn't working real well, things aren't going great. There's some pretty interesting theories as to why some of the darker times might have been the case. But it looks like some of those darker times, some of the pressures that came along with it, prompted these waves of colonialism from the Greeks. Most famously, they went and set up a colony in Syracuse that is on the island of Sicily. That's the soccer ball that the Italian boot kicks. And even to this day, there's still a ton of Greek influence there as opposed to just exclusively Italian influence. Well, this was another one of those Greek colonies. So it has Greek culture, Greek style, but the Greeks were really good at intermingling with local folk. Now, if you invaded the Greeks, you were a barbarian and a fool and an outsider culturally. But if the Greeks invaded you, the assimilation often went more smoothly. Now, this region, which comes to be known as Cyrenaica or Cyrenaica, has 5 main cities. I don't remember the names of all of them. I remember the names of a couple of them because one is Barca, which is the famous family name of Hannibal, the great general who fought against the Romans in the 2nd century, and his dad, Hamilcar. And they were from this part of West Egypt or East Libya, depending on how you frame it. And then the city of Cyrene itself. Just as a point of modern context, another one of these 5 main Greek colony cities there corresponds with modern-day Benghazi, which was obviously in the news a few years back. Well, like everything else in the ancient world, it all got screwed up with the arrival of Persia and then the arrival of Alexandria. So I think it would have been Cyrus the Great. He's the founder of Persia, who conquers Babylon and establishes Persia there in Daniel after the writing on the wall sequence. Cyrus, the great king of kings of Persia, he dies, and his son Cambyses goes on this famous conquest trip. He conquers Egypt in the late 500s BC, and I think it would have been during that time, during that campaign, that the Persians first would have laid claim to Cyrenaica. Persia has a little bit of trouble over the next couple hundred years maintaining its grasp on the farthest reaches of the empire. Maybe when things wobbled a little bit after Xerxes' defeat at the hands of the Athenians, maybe they momentarily lost control. Egypt fell out from under Persian control for a while. Presumably Cyrenaica would have gone along with that. If they couldn't control Egypt, they couldn't control something further west than Egypt. But then Alexander the Great comes along, and the entire world is brought to heel by Alexander the Great in the 330s. And then after that, the rulers of Cyrenaica would have been the descendants of Alexander's general Ptolemy. That's a family name associated with Egypt all the way up to the time of Antony and Cleopatra a few decades before Jesus. And a funny thing happens as Cyrenaica, which is not some desert wasteland. It's actually a pretty green agricultural area that provided value to the Roman Empire, provided food for the Roman Empire. Somewhere around 100-ish BC, there's a succession crisis amongst the kings of Cyrenaica, and one of the old Ptolemid kings just wills the entire kingdom to Rome, which is a really nice gesture, and it means there won't be a lot of blood loss. And so Rome gives Cyrenaica a pretty sweetheart deal for a while there, up until the 70s BC, when there was a lot of turmoil in the Roman Mediterranean world. And maybe it was that turmoil that made a messianic claimant, a Jewish upstart in the Jewish community, because there was one there. There was a somewhat prominent Jewish community in Cyrenaica. They have a messianic claimant rise up and cause some problems. We don't know a ton of details about it, but we know that Rome put it down swiftly and harshly and changed the governmental status of this kingdom that had been gifted to them only a couple of decades earlier to something that is a little more subject, something that looks a little bit more like the deal that Judea has when we're in the 1st century AD in the book of Matthew. Then in all of the political affairs that get rolling in March of 44 BC with the assassination of Julius Caesar, and then the rivalries that come out after that is there's this scramble for power and scramble to determine who gets to define what Rome is moving forward. The 2 major opponents in that are Octavian, Julius Caesar's grandson, who takes the name Caesar Augustus, which means surprise, he wins, and his rival, the right-hand man of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, who you remember from the play and from being the famous lover of Cleopatra. Well, Cleopatra is of Ptolemid descent. She lives in North Africa. And so this whole region that's under the sway of Egypt is Mark Antony's base. He raises a prominent legion there, though I don't know off the top of my head if that legion factored in any of these fights. And he even resided in Cyrene for a time. So Mark Antony was a Cyrene as well. Ultimately, the forces of Octavian, who becomes Augustus, wins out. The Roman Empire, as we think of the Roman Empire during the time of Jesus, takes shape. I am seeing that we are not going to get through this whole Cyrene thing in one conversation. That's fine. This format lends itself to doing things in 2 chunks if we need to. So I'm going to hit pause right here, and then we'll pick up right where we left off next time around. Thanks for doing the history deep dive with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.